likes to be referred to as Mo. Okay. She's a criminal defense attorney committed to supporting people's struggles for liberation. She's a founding member of Just Info, a 24-hour hotline providing legal information, service, referrals, and opportunities for the community-based organizations against aggressive policing and mass incarceration. She also is a member of Mutant Legal, a collective devoted to popular legal education for groups and individuals targeted by law enforcement on the basis of perceived identity rather than conduct. Mo also teaches criminal law in the undergraduate political science department at Hunter College. Mo will be talking to us about knowing what our rights are and what to do when we're confronted in these situations by law enforcement. Let's give a round of applause to Mo.
Hi. So I'm with Just Info. We're here today with Mr. Eric Waters, who's our project manager. We have a banner and some flyers, some business cards over there. I'm going to talk to you real briefly about what we do, and then I'm going to do a Know Your Rights training, okay? So some of these questions that I've been hearing asked to the officer here, I can go some way toward answering. So Just Info was founded a couple of years ago. We're a 24-hour hotline. The number is 1-855-878-4630. So it's 185 Just Info, but the O at the end of info is a 0. Okay? We formed actually kind of out of, y'all remember Occupy Wall Street? Okay, so during Occupy Wall Street, there was a hotline that was set up for the protesters to call. And it was set up so that the National Lawyers Guild could track people who were being arrested during these mass arrests through the system and make sure that no one got lost, make sure that everyone had a lawyer, and provide them sort of support from the point of their arrest to the disposition of their case. So people were calling in to report arrests, and that was sort of the main idea of the hotline. But what would happen is there would be a lot of arrests, and people's friends would call in and say, my friend got arrested, do you know where they are? And we would answer some of these questions. And then people would be released and they would have tickets. And 2 weeks later, the people who had been arrested would start calling. And they would say, I lost my ticket. Where do I go? I'm not going to be in town the day I'm supposed to go back to court. What do I do? I think I have a warrant. What do I do? I can't find my attorney. And we thought, man, these are really serious questions. They're simple questions. They're not legal advice questions, right? They're about legal information. But if you couldn't find the answer to that question, there could be really serious consequences. And so then we started being in court and seeing these mostly white, mostly college-educated young people who are the vast minority of people who are in the criminal courts, right? And their legal and social outcomes, because they had access to this hotline and access to these answers to fairly simple questions that they otherwise wouldn't have had, because they had access to that information, their outcomes, legally and socially, were really, really good. We were having a lot of dismissals, a lot of ACDs. We were really seeing positive or more positive or less negative outcomes, dispositions, and what we would call collateral consequences of conviction, right? The loss of certain privileges as a result of a criminal conviction, just on the basis of these kids having access to that information. And we thought, well, what is the rest of the city doing? The rest of the city who's trying desperately not to get arrested, who's being targeted by the police, right? Who's having a lot more involuntary encounters with the NYPD. What are they doing if they miss a court date? What are they doing if they don't know who their lawyer is or they can't find their attorney? And so we looked into it, and the fact was there was nothing there. There was no hotline for them to call. There was no single source of information. So we made one. And that's what Just Info is. So if you call Just Info and you say, my child has been arrested at this intersection, what precinct are they at? How do I post bail? How do I put money on someone's books at Rikers? I have 3 different summonses and I don't know which, where I'm supposed to be going for each of them. We can help you figure that kind of thing out and make sure that you're not missing court dates and getting bench warrants. Make sure that you can find your kid in the system. We can talk to you about what your constitutional rights are. I wish the police hadn't left. I think I would really like them to hear this presentation. So in any case, what we do is we provide a very simple intervention, which is providing information in hopes of mitigating, reducing, or eliminating the harm that comes from having encounters with law enforcement. We also give service referrals, because one of the things, not always, but one of the things that can be a determinant of interaction with law enforcement is the way that law enforcement perceives your identity, right? We all know that you don't have to commit a crime in order to get arrested. You don't have to commit a crime in order to be convicted, and you certainly don't have to commit a crime in order to be targeted for law enforcement attention, right? This is a reality. There are incentives in place for police to do things like stop, question, and frisk after a great deal of very intense litigation. The courts in the Southern District of New York said, yeah, there really isn't supposed to be a conflict between your constitutional rights and what the police are doing. The police are supposed to conform their conduct to the United States Constitution. And here's, what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. We know that the reality of the situation is different, right? That there is often a conflict between the Constitution and the way that police are engaging in their jobs, and that what they are often policing is identity, right? Where you live, what you look like, how you're dressed, as opposed to criminal conduct. So we do various kinds of service referrals, to deal with some of the issues that surround that perceived identity, right? So we can put you in touch with organizations that are community-based organizations that do empowerment work with whatever identity groups you belong to. We also have service referrals for housing issues, because one of the things we see is that a lot of landlord-tenant issues that really should be in housing court end up in criminal court. We have service referrals for mental health care, for physical health care, and also for substance abuse issues, right? Because that can be another really big determinant of interaction with the police. And also we have service referrals for homelessness issues, because homeless people and homelessness is another identity that can really, I don't want to say draw the attention of the police, because that's sort of some victim blaming, but that's another source of unwanted interactions and unnecessary interactions with the police. So that's what Just Info does. We're 24 hours. We do not give legal advice. We give legal information. So the difference between legal advice and legal information is that if you asked me about the very specific facts of a case that you were involved in and said, what should I do? That would be legal advice, right? Legal information is to ask a question that the answer is going to be the same for everyone, right? The Constitution says the following. This is how you get to 100 Center Street. Here's how you look up your next return date online. That's legal information. So that's the primary service that we offer, apart from the referrals. And the final thing that we can do is help you get in touch with these accountability mechanisms that you were asking about. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Jarrell. Jarrell, some of these accountability systems that you were asking about, we can help you find civil rights attorneys, right? And we can help you navigate the CCRB, which, it doesn't have the kind of teeth that we would necessarily want it to as an enforcement mechanism, but it is real. And it can be actually really important if you have an experience like the one you described. First of all, the police are always supposed to be marked, so even if they're plainclothes, they should have a badge, and you have a right to ask them for their shield number. Yes?
That was also a part of it. I asked his name.
And he didn't give it.
That turned into
Right. Right. So there are a bunch of ways in which police misconduct can actually serve to further conceal police misconduct and prevent accountability. Right. And I can talk to you a little bit about some of those. But so, you know, we're just a resource if you have a question, if you have an issue. We do answer calls anonymously, so, you know, we don't ask for your name. We collect a very small amount of data just so that we can try to track trends geographically. So if we see, you know, that every Saturday night people in the 50th precinct are calling about the same thing, then we can see, okay, something's going on there. But we don't track any identifying information about you. And we also would encourage you not to give us any identifying information on the phone. But we are a resource in that way. And if you have any questions, I would encourage you to call. We have a whole bunch of business card-sized flyers over there on that table. And please take as many as you want. Give them to your kids. Give them to your friends. I think that it's a useful thing to have on you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about what your rights are and just do a sort of basic know your rights training, okay? As I said, it really is important to remember that there isn't supposed to be a conflict between the rights that I'm going to talk to you about and what the police are doing. The police are not supposed to get angry at you invoking your constitutional rights. They have sworn to uphold the Constitution. That said, there is nothing, there are no magic words that I can give you or your kids that will prevent your rights from being violated. And there are no magic words that I can give you that will keep you actually safe. So I'm going to talk to you about what your rights are and how to invoke them and why you should invoke them. But you always have to make that decision for yourself in the moment and do what feels safest to you. It's truly, I can tell you what the Constitution says, but in the moment of an encounter with law enforcement, the Constitution is not the thing that carries a gun, right? And I'm really, really sorry that I can't stand here and give you magic words. But this is what I got, okay? So, you have several rights, and there are some really specific ways of invoking those rights, okay? So a police officer has a right to walk up to you on the street and talk to you in the same way that I have a right to walk up to any stranger on the street and say, hi, what's your name? Where are you going? Now, if I walked up to any stranger on the street and said, hi, what's your name? Where are you going? They might be a little concerned, and they would probably ignore me. I would not necessarily recommend ignoring a police officer, but the fact is they have no more right to a response than I would, right? They have a right to ask you. They have what is called the common law right of inquiry. If an officer comes up and asks you a question, you can answer with another question. And I want you all to repeat this with me, okay? The question you ask is, am I free to go? Okay, say it with me. Am I free to go? Again, am I free to go? If they say yes, you bounce. If they say no, the next question is, am I being detained? So, am I being detained?
Am I being detained?
The reason you have to ask is because if you are being detained, it's important to know that. It's important to know that you're being detained because if you're being detained, the police have a couple of rights that they wouldn't have otherwise. It also means that they have to have a reason, okay? They have to have articulable, reasonable suspicion to detain you. That means that it needs to be a real reason. It can't be inarticulable, or as Justice Thurgood Marshall referred to, sort of pretend reasons or unlawful reasons, right? Like I'm detaining you because you're a black man between the ages of 14 and 21, would not be an inarticulable reason, it would be an unspeakable reason. So if you say, am I being detained? and they say no, what do? You
Bounce.
You bounce. And if they say yes, then you can say why, right? They may or may not give you a reason. They may give you a reason that's clearly untrue. But you need to remember, at this point, you need to be very, very alert. And you need, if you can, if they are marked, remember their name and their badge number, right? And remember what they say when you ask why. If you are being detained, they have some rights. They have a right to do a couple of things. One thing is they can ask you if they can search you. To which we say loudly, so that whoever is standing nearby taping it with their cell phone can pick it up, I do not consent to this search. Okay, say this with me. I do not consent to this search. It's really important that you say, I do not consent to this search, because if you don't say anything, you have consented. Okay? Like over 90% of searches are consensual because the person who is the subject of the search doesn't say anything. Okay? Cops cannot go into your pockets. They can ask you to empty your pockets, but you are under no obligation at that point to do so. Okay? And it's really, really important for you to invoke that right, even if you don't have anything on you, right? It's because it is your constitutional right. You have a right to privacy, right? We close the door to our bathroom. We have curtains on our windows and locks on our doors. And nobody thinks that that is strange. Nobody would get angry with us for demanding those rights to privacy. And in the same way, the contents of your pocketbook and your pockets can also be private. The other thing the cops have a right to do if they feel threatened, if they reasonably feel threatened, is to frisk you, which means that they can pat you down over your clothes to check for weapons. They can't pat you down over your clothes to check for something that is not a weapon, right? They can't ask you to strip, right? They can pat you down over your clothes to check for weapons if they have a reasonable fear for their safety. Who defines reasonable? They do, right. So you should just be aware that that is a right that they have, and those are the limits of that right. They can't unzip you. They can't remove layers of clothing. They can pat you down to make sure you don't have a gun. The third thing they can do at that point is to ask you for your identification. If you are a citizen of the United States, you have no affirmative obligation to carry identification with you or to show it to the police. However, it can make your life much harder if you don't. The reality of this situation is that if they're asking you for your ID on the street, it is very likely because they want to issue you a summons, which they can do on the street. They can write you a ticket and hand it to you and off you go. If you don't show them your ID at that point, they can arrest you and take you to a precinct until they verify your identity, which is just a much more difficult and frustrating process. So if you are on the street and you are being detained, they can ask for your ID, and it is probably going to be easier for you to give it to them, but you don't have to. Okay? It's not an independent offense. They can't charge you. It's not a crime to refuse to show an officer ID. That said, they very well may just, if you even question it, if you take too long to show the ID. I've had clients who just get dragged off. And in fact, I was dragged off to a precinct once for asking an officer why he wanted to see my ID. So that's a thing that is real and happens. So if you actually are at a point where the officer has detained you and it's clear that you're going to be arrested, there's a couple of things that you need to do, or that I would highly recommend that you do. One thing that I would recommend that you do is say out loud, I am not resisting. Okay, so let's practice this. I am not resisting. This can be important because sometimes what happens is that people get a resisting charge whether or not they were resisting. And so it can be very helpful if you're narrating to the officer. It can be psychologically very helpful for them to hear that you're not resisting. It can also be very valuable later in court if you have video of you saying that you're not resisting. The next thing that happens is the second you are cuffed, there is one and only one thing that you need to say to a police officer, and this is so important. All of the other rights that I've talked to you about, all of the other magic words I've given you that help you invoke your rights are only useful later, right? They're useful if you say, I do not consent to this search, right? And the officer goes into your pockets and finds something. That would be evidence that was unlawfully obtained. It would be evidence that was obtained in violation of the Constitution. And that evidence then could be suppressed later at trial. That's a right that you invoke so that you have a benefit later. But the one right that you can really invoke that has meaning in the moment is your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Okay? This is the most important thing that I can tell anyone ever. Okay? So you say, I am going to remain silent and I want to speak to a lawyer. Okay? Let's practice this 3 times. I am going to remain silent and I want to speak to a lawyer. I am going to remain silent and I want to speak to a lawyer. I am going to remain silent and I want to speak to a lawyer. I understand that it is hard to say this to somebody who is in a blue uniform. It may be hard to say anything, but you have to invoke that right. You have to say it in that specific way, or it doesn't count. Once you have invoked that right, you have to actually remain silent, because the way you waive your right to remaining silent is by talking. So you can talk. You can say, I need to go to the hospital, or I need to use the bathroom. You can sing, but do not even engage in small talk with the police if you are in custody, right? Don't tell them what you had for breakfast. Don't tell them what baseball team you like. You know, on TV, how everyone gets Mirandized, they say, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you. There's a truth there and a lie there. The lie is that every time you're arrested, you're Mirandized. You aren't. And they have no responsibility to read you your Miranda rights unless and until they take you into a room to do what's called a custodial interrogation. You are very unlikely to be Mirandized if you're arrested. That's what I'm doing right now. I am Mirandizing you. I am letting you know what your rights are. But the truth that is in those TV shows is that anything you say can and very much will be used against you, okay? You cannot talk your way out of an arrest. But even if you are innocent, you can talk your way into a conviction. All right? It's very, very important to remember that, and it's very important for especially young people, I think, to understand that, because they really believe that their factual innocence will protect them. And it won't. All right? Another way that I say this sometimes is even a fish wouldn't get caught if he kept his mouth shut. Please remember that these rights are not just for innocent people, and they're not just for guilty people. They're for everyone, right? It is really important to remember that you don't have to have committed a crime in order to end up with a conviction. There's huge numbers of people who end up pleading guilty to things they didn't do because the consequences of not pleading guilty seem so daunting. All right? One big thing you can do to help yourself is to invoke your right to silence and actually remain silent. If you end up in a jail cell and you really need medical attention, sometimes the police will tell you it's going to take longer. Go get medical attention. Just go get medical attention. If you need medical care, ask them to take you to the hospital. Because one of the things that, as a criminal defense attorney, I have seen more times than I care to remember is somebody picking up a felony assault on an officer charge. And usually what that means is that the person viciously attacked the officer's nightstick with their face. And the felony assault charge is sort of used to retroactively justify that violence. So being able to go in, first of all, you need medical care. Just, apart from any legal ramifications, if you need medical care and you are in holding, don't let them talk you out of it. Get medical care. And second of all, it's a very good way to document that you, started out your day without a black eye and a broken nose and ended your day with a black eye and a broken nose. So that can be helpful both for your criminal case and if you want to have one or have the fact pattern for one, a civil suit. The last thing I want to talk to you about is filming. Okay? Actually, first I want to practice this again. Okay? I am going to remain silent. And I want to speak to a lawyer. This is your mantra, okay? You've got to remember this. You say that you're going to remain silent, and then you remain silent, all right? If you need something, you can talk, but then you re-invoke your right to silence, okay? Please do remember that the police are trained to make inquisitive small talk, and they really, really will use anything you say against you. They're paid to make arrests and build cases. They are not paid to make small talk with you about baseball, right? So I'm not trying to say that every person who is an officer of the law is 100% of the time out to get you, but you really need to remember who they work for and what their goals are. Because once you are in holding, if you're on the street and you want to say good morning to an officer, there's not a lot of danger there. If you are in holding and an officer is quizzing you about your family life, I would be very circumspect about sharing any of those details. Okay? So the last thing I want to talk to you about is filming the police. You have a right to film the police. At this point, it is looking more and more like it will end up being a constitutional right to film the police. You have a right to film the police within a reasonable distance. Who defines reasonable? Yeah. So I'm going to recommend what I call the mama bear rule. Excuse me. Don't get in between an officer and the person that they are trying to arrest. That makes sense, right? And if they ask you to move back and say, I am moving back. Because it's psychologically helpful for them to hear that you're doing the thing they told you to do. You say, I am moving back, officer, and you move back as little as possible. Okay? It can be really important to film the police. It doesn't always work, right? We all saw the Eric Garner video. It doesn't always do what we are hopeful that it will do. I don't think there is any way that I can, convey to you the power to hold the police accountable in more meaningful ways. But it is really important for them to understand that the communities in which they're operating have their eye out and are aware that they have rights, that they have a right to document police conduct and misconduct. Okay? Now, the fact that you have a right to film the police does not mean you're not going to get arrested for it. Okay? There are teams of people called Cop Watch who go around and they do what it sounds like they do. They watch and film police. It can be a little safer to do cop watching in a group. But if you observe a police interaction that you want to film, as I said before, always do what feels safe to you. But it can be really, really important and really helpful for you to film those kinds of interactions and to figure out how to contact the person who was the subject of those interactions. Be very careful about posting video on the internet, though. Sometimes that can really backfire. I would definitely try to get in touch with an attorney. You could call Just Info, and we could put you in touch with an attorney to review that video and see if it's something that would be good to put out there, or if it's something that should really just go to the defense attorney or to the person who was being arrested or hassled. If you do get arrested filming the police, that is not a good arrest. Okay, it's not a lawful arrest. That's not a basis for the police to arrest you. But as long as you sort of stay back and don't get in the middle of the officer and the person they're trying to arrest, even if they threaten to charge you with obstructing government administration, right, is the words that they'll use. Filming the police is not actually a basis for that charge. So, you have to make decisions about what feels safe to you, but filming the police is a right that you have, and it can be really important, both for holding police accountable, just so that they as individuals and as an institution understand that they're being watched and monitored, and also for the people who are being harmed by police misconduct. It can be really, if nothing else, it can be really validating, but it can also be really helpful legally and socially. And in the event that there is really egregious misconduct, it can be really helpful to document that for purposes of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, for purposes of the Internal Affairs Department, and also for people's civil suits, right, when they sue the police for harm that the police have done to them. And that is, the more that we're able to document that, the more accountable we can actually hold the police. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Not a question, it's more of a statement. As I get older, it gets harder and harder for me to respect the police and take them serious. Especially how they just walked out of the first shot. They might have other things to do and jobs, but this is what they got called to do today. They should have stayed. That's number one.
I do wish they had stayed. I am a little disappointed that they didn't stay.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Well, I will stay. Can I respond? I think it can be really difficult. One of the things that I talked to my college students about was the sort of crisis of legitimacy in the institution of policing, right? That it's very difficult to take seriously this institution when, for example, the institution of policing is actually very recent. It's only a few hundred years old. And policing in the United States was developed to protect property at a time when black people were property. So it's very difficult for people to take seriously the institution as a whole, and particularly recently, as police violence escalates and as the media attention to police violence escalates, it's, I think, becoming more and more difficult for people to have respect for law enforcement. I don't think anyone needs to have respect for any individual or any institution, right? That respect has to be earned. But I would definitely remind everyone that police, whether or not you respect them, have an enormous amount of power. And so I would say it's important to have a healthy amount of caution when dealing with them. So I'm not going to recommend that you have respect or that you learn to respect something that you don't feel inclined to respect, but I would recommend that you be very thoughtful and careful in terms of any encounters with law enforcement that you do have. They have power not only in terms of their weapons, but they also have power over the rest of your life, right? Because if you are arrested and charged, there can be really serious consequences, and that's actually, what Just Info is hoping to do, is to mitigate or reduce those kinds of long-term devastating consequences. Because what we see with mass incarceration, with aggressive policing, with the school-to-prison pipeline, is this funneling of huge sections of the community in really predictable ways out of the community and into prisons, and then even if they get out of prison, into situations that ultimately may lead back to prison, but ultimately do keep them out of the community in permanent or semi-permanent ways. So our hope is that by doing workshops like this one, we can ultimately prevent or at least really reduce the kind of harm that is coming to communities that are targeted by police on the basis of their identity and not the basis of their conduct.
Any other questions for Mo? Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you for letting me come today.